June 7, 1981, late afternoon, the Jordanian desert. 8 F-16 fighter jets are skimming the earth at less than 100 feet, not flying, almost crawling through the air. Their bellies are so close to the sand that the heat distortion off the desert floor shimmers across their fuselages. The pilots aren't talking. There is no radio chatter, no reassurance from command, no confirmation that the mission is still on. Just the roar of engines and the vibration of precision-guided bombs hanging beneath their wings. Each pilot knows exactly what the rules are. One mistake, one radar ping, one moment of hesitation, one degree of error in the bomb release, and the calculation changes completely. Not just for them, for the entire Middle East. They are not on a training exercise. They are carrying the future of a nation. The target is a massive concrete dome rising out of the Iraqi desert, 18 kilometers south of Baghdad. Inside that dome is Osirak, Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor, built with French engineering, funded with Iraqi oil money, and weeks away from becoming operational. Weeks away from producing weapons-grade plutonium. The pilots have exactly 80 seconds over the target. 80 seconds to destroy a facility that took nearly a decade to build. 80 seconds to prevent a nuclear-armed Saddam Hussein. 80 seconds to change the trajectory of modern history. This is the story of Operation Opera, also known as Operation Babylon, the most consequential preemptive military strike of the 20th century. Before we go further, a word about what this documentary is and what it is not. This is not a celebration of airstrikes. It is not a defense of Israel's decision, and it is not a condemnation of it either. What it is an examination of how governments make decisions when they believe the legal and diplomatic architecture of the international system has failed them. When they conclude that waiting for permission will cost more than acting without it. That question, who decides when the rules no longer apply, is not settled. It was not settled in 1981. It is not settled today. Understanding how that decision was made, what pressures produced it, and what it set in motion is the only honest way to examine it. To understand Operation Opera, you have to go back to Paris. Not to Tel Aviv, not to Baghdad, Paris. The year is 1975. Saddam Hussein is technically the vice president of Iraq, but everyone who matters knows he is already running the country. He is 40 years old, ambitious beyond any reasonable measure, and sitting across a gilded table from French Prime Minister Jacques Chirac in the Élysée Palace. On the surface, they are discussing trade and bilateral cooperation, oil contracts, and diplomatic alignment. But what Saddam actually wants is access to nuclear technology, and France is prepared to provide it. The relationship between Paris and Baghdad had been building for years. France saw Iraq as a strategic counterweight, a way to project influence in the Persian Gulf without playing second fiddle to Washington or London. Iraq saw France as the ideal partner, willing, technologically advanced, and unburdened by colonial guilt or pro-Israel sentiment. It was a transactional friendship, and both sides understood exactly what they were getting. By 1976, the two countries had signed an agreement. France would build Iraq a 40-megawatt research reactor of the Osirak class. The French called it Osirak. The Iraqis, with a flair for historical theater, called it Tammuz I, named after the Babylonian month associated with ancient glory. It would be constructed at the Al-Tuwaitha Nuclear Research Center, 18 kilometers outside Baghdad. France insisted it was for peaceful research. Iraq insisted it would be used only for medical isotopes and agricultural studies. The international community, hungry for stability and trade in the oil-rich region, largely took both countries at their word. Israel did not believe a word of it. The Israeli intelligence community had been monitoring Iraq's nuclear ambitions since the early 1970s. What they were looking at wasn't rhetoric, it was technical capability. The Osirak reactor, nominally designed for research, was structurally suited for producing plutonium-239, the fissile material needed to build atomic weapons. The reactor was designed to run on weapons-grade fuel, highly enriched uranium-235. Once operational, Iraq could irradiate fuel rods in the reactor core, extract plutonium through chemical reprocessing, and within a few years, accumulate enough material for multiple nuclear devices. The technical pathway was visible to anyone with nuclear expertise. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't ambiguous. It was a weapons program with a research label on it, and Saddam Hussein had never made a secret of what he wanted to do with that capability. He had spoken openly and repeatedly about destroying the Zionist entity, about avenging Arab humiliations, about liberating Palestine by force. His speeches were full of violent imagery and apocalyptic promises. Now he was building the means to fulfill them. For the Israeli leadership, the calculation was existential, and it was simple. A nuclear-armed Iraq, led by a dictator who had already gassed his own people and invaded neighboring countries, could not be deterred the way a rational state actor might be. Israel is roughly the size of New Jersey. A single nuclear weapon dropped on Tel Aviv wouldn't just cause casualties, it would effectively end the state. There would be no second strike, no strategic depth, no time for retaliation. There is no version of nuclear deterrence that works when your entire country can be destroyed by one bomb. Prevention was the only option. But how do you prevent a nuclear program located 1,000 miles away, in a sovereign country, protected by multiple layers of air defense and shielded by international law? The answer began with intelligence. The Mossad launched one of its most comprehensive collection operations in history, targeting every accessible element of the Iraqi nuclear program. To plan an airstrike, you need to know everything: the reactor's design, its construction timeline, when it would go critical, who was building it, where the materials were coming from, and critically, when the window for a clean strike would close permanently. Because here is the constraint that shaped everything. Once the reactor was loaded with radioactive fuel and went operational, bombing it would release massive amounts of radiation over Baghdad. Tens of thousands of civilians would be exposed. The environmental and humanitarian consequences would be catastrophic. Israel would become an international pariah. The attack had to happen before the reactor was hot, and Mossad assessments in early 1981 indicated that French technicians were preparing to load uranium fuel within months, possibly by summer. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was nearly out of time. The Mossad's first targets were the French and Italian scientists and engineers working at the construction site. These were not militants or soldiers. They were physicists, nuclear engineers, and construction specialists. Many of them idealistic academics who genuinely believed they were contributing to peaceful energy development in a developing nation. The Mossad needed to make clear to as many of them as possible that they were, in fact, building a weapon for a dictator. The campaign started with warnings. Anonymous letters began arriving at the homes of key scientists, detailed, precise, naming their specific roles at Osirak and suggesting, in careful language, that they reconsider their employment. Some dismissed the letters as pranks, others grew anxious. A few quietly resigned, citing personal reasons. But the majority continued working, either out of professional commitment or genuine skepticism about the warnings. The Mossad escalated. In April 1979, agents broke into a warehouse in Toulon, France, where reactor core components bound for Iraq were being stored. They placed explosive charges. The cores were destroyed. The Iraqi program was set back by months. France called it sabotage. The Mossad called it a message. The destroyed components couldn't be replaced quickly. New cores had to be manufactured, tested, and shipped, buying Israel time but not much. France remained committed to the contract. What was destroyed would be rebuilt. This was a delay, not a solution. The clearest message came in June 1980. Dr. Yahya al-Mossad, an Egyptian nuclear physicist serving as Iraq's liaison to the French program, was found dead in his Paris hotel room. His skull had been fractured. A woman who had visited him earlier that evening died shortly after, in what was reported as a traffic accident. French police investigated and found nothing traceable. Iraqi government officials accused the Mossad. Israel said nothing. Al-Mossad had been scheduled to return to Iraq, carrying detailed technical documentation on the reactor's fuel cycle and operational procedures. He never arrived. Neither did the documents. The message to other scientists was unmistakable. Working on Saddam's reactor carried lethal risk. Some quietly requested transfers. Others submitted resignations. But the project continued, now under tighter security. Inside Iraq, the Mossad was running a parallel operation. Through networks built over decades, they had recruited sources inside the Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission. These were Iraqis who opposed Saddam's regime, people who understood what a nuclear-armed dictator would mean for the region, or who were simply motivated by money. They provided construction blueprints, project timelines, and security assessments. One source photographed the interior of the reactor during the construction phase and smuggled the film out of Iraq concealed in diplomatic luggage. Those photographs were invaluable. They showed the reactor's internal layout, the thickness of the protective dome, the placement of fuel assemblies, and the security configuration of the site. Another source reported on the arrival of French technicians and the delivery of uranium fuel rods. Every shipment was logged. Every technician was identified. By early 1981, the intelligence picture was precise, actionable, and alarming. Osirak would be operational within months. The window for a clean strike was closing. The decision to attack was not unanimous. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin had lived inside the shadow of the Holocaust his entire adult life. He had lost family members in the camps. He had watched and survived and drawn a lesson that he considered absolute. Jews would never again wait passively for their annihilation. When he looked at Saddam Hussein's nuclear program, he did not see a manageable threat. He saw an existential one, and he believed it demanded action regardless of diplomatic cost. But his government was divided. Defense Minister Azar Weizmann opposed the strike. He argued it was too risky, that it would isolate Israel internationally, and that the diplomatic fallout could dwarf any military benefit. He worried about escalation, about the possibility that a failed mission would leave Israel exposed without having achieved its objective. He wasn't arguing that the threat wasn't real. He was arguing that the response was dangerous. General Raphael Eitan, the chief of staff, supported the attack, but was clear that success was not guaranteed. The distances involved were enormous. The Iraqi air defenses were serious. The margin for error was razor thin. Mossad Director Yitzhak Hofi provided the intelligence that made the case, and then cautioned that military action always produces unforeseeable consequences. Iraq could retaliate. Arab nations could unite. International sanctions could follow. The operation might succeed tactically while triggering something far worse strategically. Shimon Peres, leader of the opposition Labour Party, was briefed in secret and disagreed forcefully. He called the plan reckless, the kind of adventurism that would damage Israel's relationships with both France and the United States. He argued for exhausting every diplomatic channel first, for going back to the international community with the intelligence, for trying one more time to make the legal case. Begin heard all of it. He convened small meetings with his most trusted advisors, reviewed the intelligence again, studied historical precedents, consulted military planners and historians, and then he made his decision. Israel had no alternative. The Holocaust had taught one lesson above all others. Never again would Jews wait while the mechanisms of their destruction were assembled around them. He approved the operation. It was given the codename Opera. Later, it would also be called Babylon. It would be the longest-range strike ever conducted by the Israeli Air Force. The Israeli Air Force selected 8 pilots from its elite squadrons. Every one of them was a combat veteran, men who had flown in the Yom Kippur War and subsequent conflicts, men with thousands of flight hours, men who understood that this mission was categorically different from anything they had trained for before. The mission profile was extraordinarily demanding. They would fly in tight formation at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, so low that their wings would almost brush the desert floor. They would cross Jordanian and Saudi airspace without permission. They would penetrate Iraqi air defenses, destroy the reactor in a single pass, and be back across the border before Iraqi interceptors could be scrambled. There would be no second pass, no recovery option, no search and rescue if they were shot down over hostile territory. Capture meant torture. Failure meant a nuclear-armed Iraq within years. Training began in secret at a remote airbase in the Negev desert. Israeli engineers constructed a precise scale model of the Osirak reactor using satellite imagery and intelligence reports. The dimensions of the dome, the placement of support structures, the location of anti-aircraft batteries, all of it replicated in detail. The pilots flew practice attacks repeatedly, refining their approach angles, their timing, their coordination. They flew at dawn and dusk to simulate the light conditions they would encounter over Iraq. They rehearsed emergency procedures for every conceivable failure: engine loss, weapons malfunction, radar detection, interception by Iraqi fighters. The engineering challenge was formidable. The reactor dome was constructed of thick, reinforced concrete, designed to withstand external impacts, including aircraft crashes and conventional explosions. To destroy it, each F-16 would carry 2,000-pound Mark 84 bombs fitted with delay fuses. The bombs had to strike the same point on the dome in rapid succession, each impact weakening the structure until it collapsed inward. The delay fuses would allow some bombs to penetrate the outer shell before detonating, maximizing internal damage. A deviation of just a few meters would mean mission failure. The reactor would survive. Israel would face international condemnation without having accomplished anything. The pilots studied reconnaissance photographs until they could visualize every feature of the target. They memorized terrain landmarks along the entire route: rivers, roads, power lines, anything that could orient them if navigation systems failed. They calculated fuel consumption to the liter, knowing they would be flying at the outer edge of the F-16's operational range with no margin for deviation. One pilot later described the precision required as threading a needle while riding a motorcycle at 500 miles per hour. In May 1981, the Mossad reported that French technicians were preparing to load uranium fuel into the reactor. The window was no longer just closing. It was almost shut. Begin convened a final meeting of his inner circle, senior ministers and military commanders. They reviewed the intelligence one last time. They examined the alternatives one final time. And they concluded, as they had before, that there were none. Begin gave the final authorization. The attack was set for Sunday, June 7, 1981, a Sunday afternoon when most of the French workers would be away from the site, minimizing civilian casualties. On the morning of June 7th, the 8 pilots gathered for their final mission briefing. They would be accompanied by 6 F-15 Eagles flying escort. Their role was to intercept any Iraqi fighters that attempted to engage the strike formation. The mission commander reviewed the flight plan one last time. They would depart from Etzion Air Base on the Sinai Peninsula. fly south over the Gulf of Aqaba, then turn east over Saudi Arabia, staying beneath radar coverage the entire way. They would maintain radio silence throughout the flight, communication only through prearranged signals. In the final moments before the bomb run, they would climb to medium altitude, complete the attack, then dive back down and race west before Iraqi air defenses could respond. Speed and surprise were everything. At 3:55 in the afternoon, the first F-16 rolled down the runway, engines screaming, weapons heavy under its wings. One by one, the others followed, assembling into tight formation over the desert. 14 aircraft total, 8 carrying bombs, 6 providing cover. They flew so low that Bedouin shepherds on the ground could reportedly make out the faces of the pilots inside their cockpits. For the next 2 hours, they flew in complete silence, skimming the earth at 100 feet, their wingtips almost touching. They navigated by terrain features and dead reckoning. Jordanian radar detected unidentified aircraft but assumed it was a Jordanian or Saudi training exercise. The altitude was too low for positive identification. Saudi air defense briefly tracked the formation but did not intervene. The Saudis, by most assessments, had their suspicions about what was happening and chose not to act on them. The element of surprise held as they crossed into Iraqi airspace. The tension became physical. The pilots monitored their instruments, watching for any indication that Iraqi interceptors were being scrambled. Nothing. Iraqi radar was oriented outward, searching for threats from altitude, from the east, from Iran, with whom Iraq was already at war. They were not looking for fast-moving low-altitude aircraft approaching from the west. The Israeli formation had penetrated one of the most heavily defended corridors in the Middle East without being challenged once. At 5:55 in the afternoon, Baghdad appeared on the horizon, and rising from the desert directly ahead of it, the massive white dome of Osirak, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. It was time. The pilots pulled up. After 2 hours of flying so low they could read the desert floor, they climbed to 2,000 meters, exposing themselves deliberately, willingly, because there was no other way to deliver the bombs with accuracy. This was the most dangerous 60 seconds of the mission. They were now visible to every radar system, every anti-aircraft battery, every surface-to-air missile crew within range of Baghdad. They had traded invisibility for precision. There was no going back. Iraqi air defense batteries opened fire immediately. Tracer rounds rose in bright arcs against the darkening sky. Surface-to-air missiles launched, leaving white smoke trails behind them. Anti-aircraft explosions detonated around the formation, close enough that the pilots could feel the concussive pressure through their airframes. The sky over Osirak became a grid of fire. The pilots held course, not out of recklessness, out of calculation. They had rehearsed this exact scenario hundreds of times in the Negev. They knew the Iraqi batteries had limited accuracy against fast-moving targets at this altitude and approach angle. They knew that if they broke formation now, the mission was over. So they flew straight into the fire, their targeting systems locked, their approach angles set, their hands steady on controls they had been training on for months. At exactly 6:01 in the evening, the lead F-16 released its bombs. 2 Mark 84s, each weighing 2,000 pounds, dropped away from the aircraft and began their arc toward the dome below. 2 seconds later, the second F-16 released, then the third, then the fourth. All 8 aircraft cycled through in rapid succession, 16,000 pounds of precision-guided ordnance converging on a single point at the top of the reactor dome. The first bombs struck the reinforced concrete roof, and the structure cracked. The second wave hit the same point, driving deeper. The delay fuses on several bombs allowed them to penetrate the outer shell before detonating, exploding inside the dome, where the damage was irreversible. Secondary explosions followed as internal systems ruptured. The dome collapsed inward. The reactor core was destroyed. 80 seconds after the first bomb was released, the attack was over. The pilots broke hard left, dove back to low altitude, and pushed their engines to full afterburner heading west. Behind them, Osirak was wrapped in smoke and fire. Years of construction, $400 million, nearly a decade of French engineering, Saddam Hussein's most ambitious strategic investment, reduced to rubble in less than 2 minutes. Iraqi MiG interceptors scrambled from nearby bases. Their pilots raced toward the reactor site. By the time they arrived, the Israeli jets had already crossed back into Saudi airspace, flying at treetop level, invisible to radar. The Jordanians detected them again on the return flight and, again, did nothing. At 7:35 in the evening, the first F-16 touched down at Etzion Air Base. One by one, all 14 aircraft landed safely. Not one pilot was lost. Not one aircraft was hit. In Tel Aviv, Menachem Begin received the confirmation and, by his own account, wept. He had carried the weight of this decision for months, knowing he was sending young men into extraordinary danger, knowing he was risking a regional war, knowing that if the mission failed, Israel would face international isolation without having achieved anything. They had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. That night, he called each pilot personally to thank them. He believed, without qualification, that they had prevented a second Holocaust. The international reaction was immediate, unified, and almost entirely negative. The United Nations Security Council voted to condemn the attack as a clear violation of the United Nations Charter and of Iraqi sovereignty. The resolution passed without a dissenting vote. The United States, Israel's closest ally, publicly rebuked the operation. President Reagan suspended the delivery of additional F-16 aircraft to Israel as a punitive measure. The Reagan administration's frustration was twofold. Not just that the attack had occurred, but that American-supplied weapons had been used for a unilateral military strike without prior consultation with Washington. France called it an act of aggression and a fundamental breach of trust. Iraq demanded international reparations. Arab governments across the region condemned it as Zionist imperialism and called for collective action against Israel. Even within Israel, the debate was fierce. Shimon Peres, who had opposed the mission and been right about the international fallout, accused Begin of acting unilaterally without building the political consensus that might have given Israel some diplomatic cover. Begin was unapologetic. Standing before the Knesset, he invoked the Holocaust directly, reminding the world that Jews would never again stand passively while the instruments of their destruction were assembled. He argued that Israel had acted in legitimate self-defense, that it had exercised what he called the inherent right of a state to prevent an existential threat before that threat could be deployed. He pointed to Saddam Hussein's own public statements. He pointed to the technical evidence. He dared the international community to explain what alternative Israel should have taken. The condemnations continued. The diplomatic cost was real. But the strategic logic Begin had used to justify the strike, prevent a catastrophic threat before it becomes irreversible, was now formally on the table as a doctrine. Whether the world agreed with it or not, Israel had demonstrated that it would act on it. What the world mostly missed in the immediate aftermath was something that would only become clear a decade later. In 1991, when American-led coalition forces invaded Iraq to reverse the occupation of Kuwait, military planners discovered that Saddam Hussein had maintained a covert nuclear weapons program running in parallel with Osirak, a program that international inspectors had never fully detected. Had Osirak survived and gone operational, that parallel program would have had access to reactor-produced plutonium by the mid to late 1980s. The IAEA concluded after the Gulf War that Iraq had been substantially closer to a deployable nuclear weapon than previously understood. The 1981 strike had not eliminated every pathway, but it had removed the fastest and most viable one. General Colin Powell, reflecting years later on the Gulf War, acknowledged that if Saddam Hussein had possessed nuclear weapons in 1991, the coalition's calculus would have been fundamentally different. Whether that coalition could have formed at all, whether any nation would have committed ground troops against a nuclear-armed adversary, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But the question itself illuminates what Operation Opera may have actually prevented. The operation also established something that would shape Middle East security policy for the next 4 decades, what became known as the Begin Doctrine. The principle is straightforward, and it is specifically Israeli in origin, but its implications reach far beyond Israel. No hostile state in the region would be permitted to acquire nuclear weapons capability. If diplomacy failed and international institutions proved unable or unwilling to act, Israel would use military force preemptively, regardless of international opinion, regardless of diplomatic consequence. It was not a threat. It was a declared policy, and it was backed by demonstrated capability. In 2007, Israeli jets struck a facility in northeastern Syria near the town of Deir ez-Zor. The site was later confirmed by the IAEA to have been a nuclear reactor under construction, built with North Korean assistance. Israel did not publicly acknowledge the strike for over a decade. When it finally did, officials cited the Begin Doctrine as the operational framework. The strike followed the same logic. Act before the threat becomes irreversible, accept the diplomatic cost, and say as little as possible. Both strikes are now understood as applications of the same doctrine. Both remain legally contested under international law, and both demonstrate a consistent strategic calculation. Israel has concluded that the mechanisms of international non-proliferation, the IAEA, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, diplomatic pressure, are structurally too slow to address the speed at which a determined state actor can move from construction to capability. That conclusion is not universally accepted. It is not even accepted by all of Israel's closest allies. Critics argue that Operation Opera, celebrated in retrospect because it worked, created a dangerous precedent. That preventive military action, justified by intelligence assessments of future intent, is a doctrine that can be claimed by almost any state against almost any adversary. That Iraq in 1981 was genuinely pursuing nuclear weapons does not automatically validate the legal and strategic framework used to justify the strike. If Israel's intelligence had been wrong, if Osirak had been exactly what France and Iraq claimed it was, the precedent established by Operation Opera would still exist. The logic would still be available to any government willing to invoke it. In 2003, the United States invoked a version of precisely that logic to justify the invasion of Iraq, an invasion based on intelligence assessments of weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be wrong. The parallel is not exact. The situations are not identical. But the conceptual thread is visible and direct. Act before the threat materializes. Don't wait for certainty. Accept that uncertainty is inherent in intelligence. Operation Opera did not create that logic, but it gave it a successful real-world precedent. The men who flew the mission understood none of this at the time. They understood the target, the route, and the objective. They understood the risk. What they could not understand, what no one in that mission briefing room in the Negev could have fully understood, was that they were not just destroying a reactor. They were establishing a template, a doctrine, a new answer to the oldest question in national security. How much certainty do you need before you act? The pilots returned safely. The reactor was destroyed. The mission was, by any operational measure, a complete success. But success in intelligence and military operations is rarely as clean as the mission debrief suggests. The Mossad's campaign of warnings, sabotage, and targeted killing had delayed the Iraqi program, but not stopped it. The airstrike destroyed Osirak, but not Iraq's nuclear ambition. Saddam Hussein responded to the strike not by abandoning his weapons program, but by restructuring it, dispersing it, hiding it deeper underground, making it harder to find and harder to destroy. The program that American forces discovered in 1991 was in many ways a direct consequence of 1981. Israel's strike had forced Iraq to build something more sophisticated, more distributed, and more difficult to target. There is a word for this in strategic studies: adaptation. Coercive action changes behavior, but it does not always change it in the direction the attacker intends. Sometimes it makes the problem harder, which returns us to the central question this operation raises, a question that has never been fully resolved. Menachem. Begin spent the last years of his life largely in seclusion, reportedly haunted by the casualties of the 1982 Lebanon War that he authorized the following year. Whether the success of Opera contributed to a kind of strategic overconfidence, a belief that bold unilateral action could reliably solve problems that diplomacy could not, is something historians still debate. The 8 pilots who flew the mission are in their 70s now. Several have spoken publicly about the operation over the years. They describe the technical challenge, the training, the silence of the long flight in, and the overwhelming speed of the attack itself. Some describe pride, some describe relief. None of them, at least in the public record, describe doubt. The French engineers who built the reactor returned home. Jacques Chirac, who authorized the deal as Prime Minister in 1975 and later served as President, rarely discussed it directly. France continued to play an active role in international nuclear commerce under tighter safeguards. The international condemnation of 1981 faded relatively quickly. Within a few years, the Reagan administration had quietly resumed arms cooperation with Israel. The diplomatic rupture proved temporary. What proved permanent was the precedent. International law, as it stood in 1981 and as it largely stands today, does not permit preventive war. Military action taken against a threat that has not yet materialized. It permits preemptive action in cases of imminent attack, where the threat is immediate and unavoidable. The distinction matters enormously. Osirak was not about to launch a nuclear strike on Israel. It was a facility that might, within years, produce material that could eventually be weaponized. The threat was real, but it was not imminent in the legal sense. Israel acted anyway, and the world eventually moved on. What that tells us about the relationship between international law and national security decisions is something every serious student of geopolitics should sit with for a moment. Laws govern behavior in stable conditions. They set boundaries for actors who broadly accept the system. But when a state concludes, rightly or wrongly, that the system cannot protect it from an existential threat, the law becomes one more factor in the calculation rather than a constraint that settles the question. Begin understood this. His critics understood it too. They simply drew the line in different places. The question that Operation Opera leaves open is not whether Israel was right to act. History has been relatively kind to that judgment, though not universally. The question is what a world looks like when multiple states, not just Israel, but any state with capable intelligence services and sophisticated military assets, adopt the same doctrine. When preventive strikes become a recognized tool of statecraft rather than an exceptional measure of last resort. When the decision to act is made not by international institutions, but by individual governments calculating their own survival. That world is not hypothetical. It is, in various forms, the world we already live in. Operation Opera was 80 seconds over a concrete dome in the Iraqi desert. But the questions it opened have no closing bracket, no clean end, no final answer that everyone agrees on. Only the next government, facing the next threshold, deciding how much certainty is enough, and who gets to decide?